there were some captions incorrectly put out, as pointed out by John. Here's some replacement pages for John gets them. Is there anybody who didn't get one of these folders? You.
And I think, did you get one in?
No, okay.
Logically working.
All of this is the Dummy's Guide to the Computer History Museum. It's not meant to be highly technical and whatnot.
We need the new
It should be page 11, just to be replaced. Those who produce this kind of stuff, they're not going to produce that kind of heavily curated crap for our new visible storage. What they're attempting to do now is look at all the stuff we want to put on exhibit and to provide some guidance to us as to what things are easily available. For example, how do we put labels on things? Should things be set up on plinths, smaller things, so that we can easily view them? And all of this stuff, of course, is going to be changed. Things will move in and out of the visible storage, and so we don't want specially constructed items. We want to buy stuff off the shelf. What stuff is available? That's what the exhibit designers are going to look at and try and find us some reasonable solutions to these things, so that we don't have to throw stuff away in future years and start all over again. So that when we do want to add something else in or change it around, we can easily produce new labels for things in a nice, professional-looking format, not just whatever happens to be lying around at the time, which, as I was explaining to Ron earlier, is part of the problem. I didn't have one of these nice little plastic holders for a new label he wanted, and so I just had to scurry around and find something that could be put together. Have to start to gather my thoughts here. Now, one of the things that I had emphasized in the introduction of this little booklet that you've got is that I don't particularly want everybody to give exactly the same rote tour. If you do that, it's going to be like reading from a script, and it'll be dull and it'll be boring. Besides, when people come and get a tour from me, I want them to come back again next week and get a tour from John, which will be different from what I give. Also, some of you will give highly technical tours, like Ed Thalen, and people of his ilk will give very detailed technical tours. Other people will give very broad brush tours and talk more perhaps about the people behind the artifacts than the artifacts themselves. All of this is very useful to have all these different skills. However, it was obvious that a lot of people wanted a sample tour of the sort of thing that I would normally give. And so that's why we're here this morning, is to for me to give what I would normally give as a sample tour, as an example. And Randy Neff suggested that we actually record this thing, and that he might even transcribe it in case people want it. But please, when you get this sort of thing, don't try and memorize it, because that just gives a dull and boring tour. It's like, reciting Shakespeare. If you're not right into the part, you can just sit there and recite it in a monotone, and it sounds awful. So give your own tour. But I think unless there's some, oh no, there's one other thing. Some of you are experts on certain machines, and Lafar, for example, knows an awful lot about the Lamer sieves. He's been looking at them quite intensively, trying to read the literature that Lamer wrote, figure out how they worked and things like that. So after we're done here, I'm going to ask Lafar to give us a brief, very brief.
Okay. How do you spell that, Lafar?
4 hours.
About
some talents I don't have.
We'll certainly get his much more in-depth description at some stage in the fall when we get something going here, perhaps on a volunteer day after lunch or something of that nature, when everybody's exhausted and they just want to sit and listen for a few minutes. but 10 minutes is enough to give us all some background on these machines. And you may just wander in and say, oh, those things in response to a question that somebody asks. Well, gee, I don't know terribly much about them, but they were used for number theory, and they were developed by two professors of mathematics, both named Derek Lamer, father and son, from Berkeley. And they were about the 1920s, examples of mechanical calculating machines. And that's enough to satisfy most people. If somebody wants the real ugly, gory details, they can get a hold of me, and I'll probably pass them on to the FAR. But through our website, they can ask any question they like of the collections team. The other thing that I tend to do all the time is I can never remember huge numbers of facts, how many megacycles, how many bytes of memory, this kind of thing. So when somebody says, how does this compare to an IBM PC? Well, I'll say, well, it's very difficult to compare these things, but it's approximately the same power as an IBM PC, give or take a factor of 10. And that's usually good enough, to satisfy their question.
Within an order of magnitude.
It's within an order of magnitude, yeah. Or if somebody says, gee, when was that done? Like the Lamer sieves. Well, some were done in, 1926 or something? I don't know. So something like that. I just will normally say, well, they were done in the 1920s and 30s. Close enough for everybody who wants to. And so if you use enough weasel words, you can make sure you don't tell lies, but you give out some sort of information. But I always make a very careful point of saying, gee, I don't know, but I think, or it was about, give or take a factor of 10, or something like that. There are people who give tours, of course, who like to tell stories that sound good. One of the most famous, of course, is Chris Garcia, who likes to point out that the Apollo space computer, Apollo guidance computer, is the only machine here that has been both on the moon and in the backseat of his car. And that's not exactly true, because it never left the Earth. That particular model was a prototype and it never flew. But I've now convinced Chris to say this is the same type of computer that has been both on the moon and in the backseat of my car. And, that doesn't exactly lie, and it gives some humor and things that people tend to like.
Mike, when it comes to bits and bytes, if you pick up the little signs and look on the back, I try to put things like machine cycle time, how much memory it had, and then you can use that to compare with today's machines.
And I've often done that on a tour, that somebody will say, well, when was that machine produced? And I'll think, heavens, I can't remember. You just reach over, grab the sign, turn it around. Oh, 1975. And
Helps a lot.
Yeah.
Helps a lot.
But there are some that don't have that, either because we don't know or we just haven't got around to putting it up. Whatever, and so you have a quick look and say, oops, my cheat sheet isn't here. Gee, I'm not sure. You really have to know. I can, let you know. Now, with that sort of introduction and with LaFar thinking what he's going to say for 10 minutes when we're done, what I'd like to do is just start off on a bit of a tour. And what I want to do is try and keep it down to under an hour, because most people who come here might have all afternoon, but they also have other things that they might want to do. If they're real interested, they can stay afterwards and talk to you and get all of the nasty, ugly stuff. But the formal part should be, take them around in an hour, and then if they need to, let them go. If they don't need to, grand, stick around, talk to them, and say, oh, come on, look at this. Didn't show you this, or whatever. Because you can't possibly talk about all of this stuff in an hour. You can't possibly talk about all of this stuff in 3 weeks.
And the other thing Mike can kick it around with the team and the rest of us is, we may have, a special kind of tours set up, which would be good draws for people, the Docent's tour focused on a particular kind of thing. And I think that would be a neat draw in a lot of technical detail. But we're trying to give the image of what we can get people through at the same time in a predictable way to start with, and that's sort of the first teaser. Maybe we should make it an hour and a half, I don't know. But but right now, if you can keep it under an hour, and I get a lot of tours under an hour, I have to, and adapted to the audiences. But
Yeah, and if they want to stay afterwards and they want to ask more questions, if they're really into the technical stuff, by all means, unless you have to go too.
Give a bit of a thought to that. I've kind of decided that all you can do in a tour is give a table of contents of what we have.
A table of contents and a couple of little facts about each.
But it would be kind of nice to have something scheduled later that was the entries into the table of
yeah,
contents.
so let's revisit this after you hear Mike's hour tour, because I think Mike does a fantastic tour with a lot of innuendos and insights and people that if each of us adapt and plug in our own, you can give a little bit more than table of contents. But you want the table of contents to come through, I think. That's my personal opinion, but.
Yeah, the other thing is I very often just skip whole sections. If I realize that I'm getting late, I don't even bother going back into that section of the CDC 6600 and things like that in the back, because I think, we're going on too long here. If somebody's interested, we'll take one around afterwards. If they're sitting there going, oh God, when is this going to end? Then at least they can get out. Because not everybody's interested in everything. I mean, my wife loves to go to quilt museums. And she'll sit there for hours and look at the stitching in the quilts and things like that. Well, thank you. After an hour, I'm about ready to go and be a screaming fit, although I'm very polite and stand there with a smile on my face the whole time. And that's the same sort of visitor you're going to get here.
Just think of the computer wiring when you're watching
Yes.
this demonstration.
Well, let's start this off then. What we would normally do, of course, is start off by the front door. And what I tend to do, just pretend you're at the front door for the moment. No point in all of us trooping out there. What I would do is say, welcome to the Computer Museum, Computer History Museum, and remind people that this is not a museum in its current form. This is a warehouse. And that we keep things open and visible because we like to see, we like people to see some of the artifacts we have, and that we're in the process of preparing a proper museum, of which there'll be some announcements in the press before too much longer. I also make sure I point out where the bathroom is. It's over that deck by that exit sign over there. And I also warn them that what we're trying to do is make sure that this stuff is around in 200 years, and if people keep flipping the switches and touching things, then they leave the acids from their fingers on the objects, and this, after 20 years, begins to eat through, and we've actually got objects in the back where acids from fingerprints have been permanently etched onto metal objects. Also, the plastics tend to deteriorate with the chemicals in your hands, and things that plastics were only designed for a lot of these things to last for a few years before the computers became obsolete, and consequently it's become difficult to try and maintain the plastics, which are getting brittle and discoloring. So please don't touch. You can look all you like, but please don't touch. And I also will, of course, have a set of white gloves with me that I have forgotten to get right at the moment. But if I look down in the front desk and pull out the drawer in the front table, there's a set of white gloves. And so I have these out and carry them with me the whole time. And in fact, if you'll give me just 30 seconds, I will get a pair, as long as I'm holding these white gloves. If I want to pick up something, then or to touch something to show them, I can quite easily do it, and that also gives them a visual sign that I'm trying to be careful, and so they're a little more careful as well. After that introduction, what I'll tell them is that computing, of course, has existed for many thousands of years, from when people were trying to do simple things in the mouths of caves around campfires. And initially, it wasn't, do we have 17 of these particular things for supper tonight? It was more, do we have enough of these things for supper tonight? And then, of course, as our civilization became more sophisticated, we had to learn to actually count and to process numbers of things one way or another. Computing usually takes two forms. And modern computing certainly takes two forms. One is the situation you find with accounting. And This usually means huge amounts of data with very, very few operations to be performed. Think, for example, of Sears store and their accounting system from the turn of the century, i.e. 1900, where they would have huge numbers of people processing paper, and basically all it was adding up a few figures and putting entries into books. But there were huge numbers of these operations to perform. The other form of computing is basically scientific computing, where you have very little information comparatively, but have to do huge amounts of calculation in order to gain your results. And the calculation for scientific work usually involves the more complicated operations of multiplication and division, and thus takes a lot more time and is a lot more awkward to do. Now, if we just proceed over here, this display case shows some of the instruments and objects that were used to do scientific calculation before the advent of computers. Most people will know about slide rules, and slide rules, of course, came in many different forms. There were circular forms, there were cylindrical forms, and the more standard form. These are all based on logarithms, which were invented in the early 1600s by John Napier from Scotland, and very, very quickly adapted to an instrumental situation. The adaptation was basically done by English mathematicians, and there was one in particular, a fellow named Edmund Gunter, who was a specialist in providing help for British seamen in navigation. And he invented various ways of laying out logarithms on bits of wood for them to use. Now, before that time, various bits of scientific calculation were done with these brass and ivory instruments here called sectors. And you see a picture in the back of a man, in this case a Frenchman, using a sector to do calculation. This was not a logarithmic instrument like a slide rule, but was basically a primitive analog computer that was derived from gunnery. At the advent of cannon and things into Europe, it was very difficult to aim, and the gunners developed these kinds of instruments for their own use. And of course, from there on, it spread to various forms of mechanical calculators, simple ones for use in simple addition, and more complex ones, the smallest version of which, the curta here, was used for more scientific calculation. Now, if we come out here, we'll see the other side. And this is the side where people are doing huge amounts of basically data processing, trying to do small operations on huge amounts of data. And although there were many examples, the example we show here is the first use of the punched card for data processing applications. Now, punched holes in paper and cards and little bits of wood were used in the early 1800s for controlling looms and things like this, for weaving patterns. But it was the 1880 census in the US that caused a great shift in this. The 1880 census took almost 10 years. I think it was something like 7.5 years or 6.5 years, something like that, to analyze. And by law, there has to be a census in the US every 10 years. Now, between 1880 and 1890, there were something like 13 or 16 million immigrants flooding into the US. The Census Bureau wanted a lot more information on each of the individuals, and it was perfectly obvious that the 1890 census would take more than 10 years to analyze at the going rate. So they asked for suggestions, and the contest that they had was won by a chap named Hermann Hollerith, who was a son of some German immigrants. He suggested that they take punched cards. We have an example of a modern punched card here. And the punched card would be used to hold the information for from the census form. Now, you'll notice I'm touching this particular punched card, but that's basically because we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of punched cards, and so it doesn't particularly matter if we have problems with one of these. I won't tell your average visitor that, but it's very difficult to do this otherwise. Now, after the census information was punched into the card, Hollerith devised this machine that you see behind me here, and the cards were placed in the primitive card reader, and the handle pushed down, and pins would fall through the holes or be pressed through the holes, and thus be able to read the combination of holes in the punched card. The little clock dials you see here would click one forward for each particular combination. You could rewire this panel in the back, because you might be wanting to check for how many farmers from Connecticut were of Norwegian heritage who raised oats, how many farmers from Connecticut were of Norwegian heritage who grew wheat, and so on. All sorts of combinations of things. And that's why there's so many of these clock dials. Turns out that with this system, they had a preliminary count of the entire population in 6 weeks, and they completed the entire census in about 3.5 years under budget. Now, at that time, the Census Bureau said thank you very much to Mr. Hollerith, and gave him all his equipment back, which had just been leased to the Census Bureau, and that left Hollerith with a problem. And the problem was that he only had one customer. That customer only needed him once every 10 years. And as a consequence, there was a cash flow situation. So he had to look around to find other ways of using this equipment and making money. He convinced various other countries to give a census. He convinced the Canadians and the British and the Russians and a few others to actually use this equipment in their own census facilities. But what the real turning point was the American development of the railways at the time. Because if you were shipping goods from New York to Virginia, it probably had to pass through 3 or 4 different railway systems. And each one, of course, wanted their share of the freight you had paid. And this became an accounting nightmare. And so Hollerith developed his equipment. Some early examples you can see here, a machine that would punch the cards. Other later examples are machines that would process the cards in various ways, sort them out, collate various decks together, and things of that nature. And this basically solved the accounting problem for the railways. He then continued to develop this so that the equipment was available for almost all kinds of accounting, and it was the primary accounting machines up until the 1950s and early 60s. They were in very heavy use. While these machines could do some elementary arithmetic, simple add and subtract, occasionally very special machines could multiply, there was very little in the way of their use for scientific computing on a large scale. Now, the examples of that are shown in another place in this museum, which we'll go to in a second, but basically it was the development of this need for scientific computing during the Second World War that pushed that development forward. So if we just wander down this way, now, there were 2 major developments in the Second World War which spurred the development of basically scientific computing. One of them was, of course, the attempt to break the codes that had been part of the wartime situation. And there's, of course, the famous situation where people like Alan Turing in Britain helped to break the so-called German Enigma code. There were half a dozen different German coding systems, but one of them is the Enigma, and we have an Enigma coding machine right behind you there as an example for it. The other American situation was one of military necessity as well. When American troops went to North Africa their artillery turned out to be very inaccurate. The inaccuracies were due to errors in the tables. Now, there's many reasons why those tables were in error, but nonetheless they were. And the Army had to pull out all the stops to try and recalculate these tables. These were not simple. They required huge amounts of effort, literally weeks and weeks and weeks of effort for one type of gun for one type of shell. Because the tables had to account for different air pressures, they had to account for wind, they had to account for humidity, they had to account for the propellant used in the shell, they had to account for the kind of shell that was being fired, and of course there were many different kinds of guns. Consequently, it was an almost impossible problem. The Army pulled out all the stops and asked everybody they could to help out. One of the groups they asked was the Moore School of Electrical Engineering in Pennsylvania. Now, the people at the Moore School knew that there was a scientific calculator at Harvard at the time. It was a very simple machine that would read an instruction from punched paper tape and execute it via mechanical means. It didn't use electronics at all. It used rotating wheels and things of that nature. But it would do about 3 operations a second. Now, their idea was that they could take the concepts in that machine and re-implement them in electronics. So instead of moving bits of metal or moving mechanical wheels, all you did was move electrons. Everybody thought they were nuts because electronics had only been used for amplification and radio and things like that up until that time, or at least almost no other uses except those. The 2 people, named Press Eckert and John Lockley, got the Army's approval as one out of many projects in an attempt to solve this ballistics problem, and they produced this machine known as the ENIAC that you see one part of behind me here. And this is what the ENIAC actually looked like. It was a very large machine. You actually worked inside it. It would have taken up the whole of this room behind me. And on this picture you can see a man setting all sorts of switches on a very large function table, and that's a close-up of it at the back. You can have a closer look at this in a moment. And where these function tables were connected into the machine itself, there's a very large panel here, and that's this particular one. Problem with this was that without moving anything mechanically, it would be able to operate much faster. In fact, it could do about 5,000 operations a second. But how do you control that? The machine at Harvard that they were trying to base this concept on could read 3 instructions a second from paper tape. If you tried to read paper tape at 5,000 instructions a second, the only thing that would happen is the paper tape would catch fire. You simply can't read paper tape at that speed. If it didn't catch fire, it would certainly break. And so they had to come up with some other scheme, and the scheme was to basically completely rewire the machine. And here you see some plug board holes, or some plug holes on the front of this particular panel where the various cables and things would be plugged in. The switches would be set to perform the required operation, and after that job was done, the whole machine had to be stripped down and rewired to perform the next one. They were about halfway through the construction of this when they realized that this was going to be a very awkward procedure, that it would take hours and sometimes even days to set up the wiring for a complicated problem. And one of the things they suggested was it would be very nice if somehow or other we could store the wiring diagram into the machine and have the machine automatically rewire itself. Now, they had ideas of using things like phonograph records or discs with little magnets embedded in them that would represent the wiring diagram. And then they could basically play these and have the machine rewire itself for any particular job. But this was the start of the concept of the stored program. So the idea came from this machine, but it was never actually implemented. The Army told them not to worry about these newfangled ideas, get this machine to operate first. The machine was not finished in time to help out with the ballistics of the Second World War, but it certainly was used by the Army for ballistics for about 11 years in their research establishment in Maryland. Now, it's been speculated, and it's only speculation, that this machine basically changed the world because with the fact that it could do 5,000 operations a second and that it was kept busy for 11 years in Maryland, it probably during that time did more arithmetic than all mankind had done from the beginning of civilization up until 1944. And that's quite a change when you could lump all of that. And so all sorts of problems suddenly became possible to accomplish that were simply not possible before. The scientists absolutely loved it. And the concept of this stored program was taken after the war and distributed to various scientific and technical groups around the world. The first people to implement it were the people at the University of Manchester in England. They built a very small machine, always known as the Manchester Baby, which was capable of running a stored program. It only had 32 words of memory, so a few instructions and a few bits of data was all it could do. But it proved that the concept was correct, and that's all they were trying to do at the time. They had no idea whether this newfangled idea of a stored program would actually work. The group at Cambridge University in England quickly followed a year later in 1949 with a usable machine that had enough memory. It had something like 1,000 words, I can't honestly remember now, to actually perform useful arithmetic on the machine. One of the people who wanted to build one of these newfangled computers was an American mathematician named John von Neumann. And von Neumann came from the Institute of Advanced Study, or for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. The problem was, this was a think tank. It wasn't a engineering school with the ability to construct things. And so it took him several years to build the infrastructure for the creation of a computer, but he eventually did. He wasn't the first by any means. There were many other computers in operation by the time his machine was going in about 1952, I think, certainly the very early years of the 1950s. But he was quite influential because he was an academic and assumed that all this information should be made free and easily available to anybody who wanted it. And so if you wanted to have a computer, like the one at the Institute for Advanced Study, all you had to do was write to von Neumann, and he would quite happily send you copies of his blueprints. He would even occasionally lend his experienced technicians to other groups. And so many other examples of von Neumann's machine were produced, none of which were entirely compatible, but they were all very, very similar. And thus his ideas for how to build a computer became widespread. One of the first to build a copy of the machine was the University of Illinois. And they called their machine the ENIAC for Illinois' copy of the Institute's automatic computer. That's where the IAC comes from. And many other groups did the same thing. The Weizmann Institute in Israel built one, and they called it the WISAC. The University of Sydney in Australia built one, and they called it the SILIAC. All sorts of people did other things. Where did you come from?
I come from Iowa State
Iowa
University, but they didn't put the IAC on the end.
No, they called it the Cyclone, I think, didn't they?
Michigan called it Maniac.
Yes, Michigan called theirs the Maniac. And the Maniac was also the name of a machine done at the Los Alamos. There were a couple of different machines with the nickname Maniac. But all of these copies have been destroyed. The only copy that remains is one that was done by the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, and they called theirs the Johnniac, and this is the large unit that you see behind me here. It's obviously vacuum tubes, and it's obviously not a production model. If you look at the wiring, it's all hand done, and was experimented with heavily during its lifetime. Things rewired, changed as new ideas came up. This machine was almost lost. It was in a museum in Los Angeles, and they decided that they didn't particularly want it, and so they cut it apart and threw it out into the parking lot, awaiting the garbage collection. And a man named Keith Unkefer, who was part of the original group that made it just happened by chance to be visiting the museum and see the pieces. He called us, and it got rescued. Unfortunately, there's so much damage been done that it would never be operational again. But it is now the only one of its kind left. Now, if we proceed around here, once the concept of the stored program computer became available, and it was obvious that it was quite a useful thing, although it, of course, enormously expensive in the 1950s, other people started seeing different applications for it. One of them was, of course, the military. And in the 1950s, during the Cold War, we had the situation where military believed that Russian bombers would come over the North Pole and would be a threat to North America. And so to counter this, the North American Air Defense System was set up, NORAD, and some method had to be obtained of not only monitoring the skies with radar, but also communicating that radar information around and analyzing it when the individual radar traces were presented. The obvious solution was a computer, and the people from MIT who had designed a computer called Whirlwind at the time used their design to suggest a solution to this problem. The military took the design of Whirlwind and basically ended up giving it to IBM for construction of many large units. There were about 21 of these, I think, installed across North America. This machine was known as SAGE, and it stretches from the memory unit here all the way down to the end of these very large cabinets. Now, this is about 10 or 15%, I suppose, of one SAGE machine. It was enormous. It would take up about half a football field in area when it was actually installed, and they always had two of these machines side by side, so in case one of them failed, the other one could take up the operation and continue on, and thus any SAGE installation had an area of about the size of a football field, along with many people operating the radar traces and things of that nature. You can see the vacuum tubes as we proceed along. This was such a successful machine in what it did that long after transistors and integrated circuits and things were invented, the military still kept these machines in operation, and in fact they were the system controlling the radar or controlling the skies in North America up until the early 1980s. Turns out that after about 1961, even before the last of these was installed, they were basically useless for detecting the bomber threat because that had been replaced by the threat of ICBMs, but they were certainly very useful in just controlling the air traffic over North America, and in fact all of the air traffic control systems that we have today are basically descendants of these machines. As we pass, there are the control consoles for this SAGE machine, and you can see one with a radar scope on it and a smaller one beside it here. The scope, the operator with the scope could detect any unknown track, and using this light gun that you see on the desk in front of it, communicate back to the machine which track it was. And if it was something very suspicious, the intercept technician who was sitting here could in fact plot an intercept course and helped to control aircraft to go up and actually have a look at this machine. Now, there's no chance of talking about everything, but let me just mention in passing that IBM, that was the contractor to build the SAGE, made huge amounts of money off that, and used that money in order to develop some of their better known equipment. Now, from very heavy scientific calculation, we get back to the era of business data processing. And this grouping here illustrates a small IBM data processing machine. As you can see, it's physically much smaller. First of all, it's transistorized, but it also had much fewer abilities than the big scientific machines, and was designed mainly for processing high volumes of data. It turned out to be a glorious success because IBM used it to replace all of the punched card equipment that they had been selling earlier. The early accounting machine equipment that Hollerith had developed. And although the machine itself, the box you see in the back, was not at the forefront of technology, what was at the forefront of technology was their card reader here and their line printer here. They were acknowledged as the two best in the business, and they were about as robust as any data processing equipment ever made. These characteristics alone sold about 14,000 of these machines, I think it was, so something of that order anyway. And again, made IBM huge amounts of money and established them as the leader in the field. Now, from the sublime to the ridiculous, we come back to this particular space age looking machine. This is a machine that was developed out of a standard Honeywell microprocessor. The front panel that you see here is the front panel of a Honeywell 315 computer, which actually extends back into the base. And this mounting for it was prepared by Neiman Marcus, the big department store organization, that in the 1960s decided that every household needed a computer to organize their recipes. But of course, the kitchen computer, as it was set up, was still very expensive. They charged $10,600 for this machine. And the awkward part of it was that there's no keyboard and there's no display. And so if you were trying to use it, the only way you had of entering information was these binary switches on the front, and the only way of getting information back out was through these little red lights that you can see in the back. And consequently, it was basically useless to anybody unless you happened to be a computer engineer, and even then it would probably take you several hours to set something up rather than just flip open a cookbook and have a look at it. It was strictly a toy, and because of that, they didn't sell any. The price of $10,600 in the early 60s could have gotten you a 3-bedroom bungalow in many places in North America, and consequently, if you could afford to buy it, you probably already had cooks and various things in the household anyway. As I said, this was the only one they ever made. It was the prototype. As far as we know, there's no indication it was ever used for anything. Now, most people know of Seymour Cray, who established his name as the designer of supercomputers. And this, of course, is the big scientific calculation again, rather than business or toy calculations. But Seymour Cray began his career working for UNIVAC. And when he worked for UNIVAC, one of their jobs was to create a machine to help in battlefield situations to coordinate radar and guns and things on large battleships. And one of his first jobs was to design this machine that you see behind you here looking like a large refrigerator called the Naval Tactical Defense System. This is a later model. The first one was looking much like a bathtub rather than a refrigerator, but it's obviously built like a battleship for military use. When Seymour had finished this design, he very quickly left UNIVAC to join a company called Control Data Corporation, which was just being founded in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And this company had hoped to get contracts with the government for selling large-scale computers. But these contracts were just not forthcoming. And the company very nearly went broke before they started getting any contracts at all. One of the things that they needed was some example of a computer to show people what their abilities were. And Seymour Cray decided that he would build a machine that was an example for them to show off and also to use as a prototype for something that they might want to produce later. And that machine is right next door to it here. The little character was their prototype. And one of the things that you can easily see on this is the individual transistor boards. You can see a little piece of core memory, that square unit on the left-hand side. And it was made by Cray himself. And the story goes that he was looking for transistors, and they had to be very cheap transistors because of the financial situation of the company. And so he went down to their local electronic supply house and bought the cheapest transistors he could find. Later, when he needed more, he went back and discovered that the price was 3 times as high. When he inquired why, he was told that because the first ones he had bought were substandard and didn't even pass the manufacturer's specifications. But it's a tribute to his design abilities that, in fact, those transistors are still incorporated in this unit and the machine still functions. Now, if we just proceed down the little hallway here, to the far end, we see another example of Cray's efforts. The first one we come by is this little desk. And the desk is, in fact, the production version of that prototype machine. The desk is the CDC 160. All of the electronics fit in the drawers of the desks, and the magnetic tape that you see behind it was part of this unit as well. The machine was used for controlling small production line situations, for testing of various bits of electronics, and for also doing some fairly elementary calculations, because it didn't have all that much ability. Now, Cray's ambition was always to produce the largest and the best computers, and so after he produced this, he produced several others which turned out to be the biggest computers of the time, but what was really the watershed mark was this machine that you see behind me here. It actually consisted of 4 big bays, 2 of which are shown here because we physically don't have a room for the others, and a control unit. The machine itself pushed the electronics and the design of the equipment to about as hard pushed it about as far as it could go. And in doing so, Cray came across the problem of trying to get rid of the heat that built up from all of the electronic circuits. And he solved that problem by actually wiring or running refrigerant through the system. And in the back here you can see some of the refrigeration equipment that he included. There's a large mass of wires here, and people look at that and think, gee, it looks very amateurish. But in fact it was done deliberately because what Cray wanted to do was eliminate as much as possible any circuit used for delay, because it's often necessary to have 2 signals arriving at some part of the computer at exactly the same instant. And if Cray was needing to have something delayed by a few nanoseconds to make sure these signals arrived at the same time, most people would put in a small electrical circuit to cause that delay, but Cray knew that electricity travels about 11.5 inches, call it a foot, in 1 nanosecond, and so if he had to delay something by 4 nanoseconds, he simply used 4 feet of wire between the 2 points to cause the delay. Now, that machine remained the fastest of its day until he produced his next machine, which is the 7600, this thing with the blue glass panels, and that also remained the fastest machine of its day. The CDC, Control Data Corporation that Cray worked for at the time, used this niche of very large scientific calculators the type that would be used by the Atomic Energy Authority, weather prediction, and the military as their basic niche. They didn't produce the small data processing style machines that IBM did. And so they only made few of these machines, but of course they made huge profits on the ones they did make, whereas IBM would produce sometimes thousands of much smaller machines.